The schoolhouse was smaller than the advertisement had promised, and the man standing beside it was not part of the deal at all. Lin Fen clutched the handle of her worn leather satchel, the paper inside a crisp, official-looking document from the Redemption Gulch Town Council. It had arrived by post in San Francisco, a response to her own carefully penned letter seeking a teaching position away from the city's clamor. The advertisement in the territorial newspaper had spoken of a new school, eager children, and a modest but respectable salary. It mentioned nothing of a silent, broad-shouldered man with eyes the color of a stormy sky, whose gaze was fixed on the dusty road as if he were waiting for a storm he knew he could not stop. She wore her best dress, a dark green poplin that felt heavy and out of place under the searing Nevada sun of 1878. The fabric was meant to look respectable, durable, American. It was a shield, but she felt it melting with every passing second. The wagon driver, a man named Gus with tobacco-stained teeth, grunted as he unloaded her single trunk. "This is it, miss. Redemption Gulch. What there is of it." Lin Fen looked from the one-room schoolhouse, little more than a clapboard box with a crooked bell tower, to the man who still hadn't moved. He was weathered, his face a map of sun and wind, his hands hanging loose at his sides. They were large, calloused hands, the kind that knew work and nothing else. He wore denim trousers tucked into scuffed boots and a plain cotton shirt that had been washed to a pale, uncertain blue. "Are you Mr. Stone, from the council?" she asked, her voice clearer and steadier than she felt. The man finally shifted his gaze to her. There was no welcome in it, only a deep, unsettling weariness. "No, Name's Samuel Blackwood. Jebediah Stone is waiting for you inside." He gestured toward the schoolhouse door with a slight tip of his head, then turned his back to her and began inspecting the harness on one of Gus's horses, as if her arrival were a minor interruption he was keen to move past. A cold knot formed in Lin Fen's stomach. This was not the welcome she had envisioned. There was no delegation of smiling town mothers, no gaggle of curious children. There was only dust, shimmering heat, and a man who looked at her as if she were a bill he could not pay. Taking a breath, she walked up the 2 plank steps and pushed open the door. The inside smelled of fresh sawn pine and something else, something acrid and male. 3 men sat around a small, unfinished table. The one in the center, a portly man with a florid face and a tight vest straining at its buttons, rose to his feet. "Miss Lin, I presume?" Jebediah Stone, head of the town council. He did not offer his hand. "Welcome to Redemption Gulch, Mr. Stone," she acknowledged, her eyes scanning the other 2 men, who merely nodded from their seats. They were ranchers or miners by the look of them, their faces hard and impatient. "We trust your journey was adequate," Stone continued, gesturing for her to take the only other chair, a simple, backless stool. "We have the final contract here for you to sign." A formality. He slid a piece of paper across the table. It was not a copy of the letter of employment she already possessed. The heading was different, the script denser. Her eyes moved down the page, her English, honed by years with the sternest of missionaries, making quick work of the legal script. She saw the clauses about the school term, the curriculum, the salary of $20 a month. But then she saw the other words, nestled under a section titled Homestead and Community Provision. Her breath caught. The words blurred and then sharpened with terrifying clarity. The aforementioned teacher, Lin Fen, does agree to enter into legal matrimony with the landowner, Samuel Blackwood, widower, as a condition of this permanent appointment and to satisfy the residency requirements of the Homestead Act of 1862, under which this parcel is claimed. The pine scent in the room became suffocating. The air grew thick and heavy. She looked up from the paper, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. "What is the meaning of this?" Her voice was a whisper. Jebediah Stone steepled his fingers, his expression one of patronizing patience. "A practicality, Miss Lin. A simple practicality. The school sits on Mr. Blackwood's land. The law requires a family to hold a homestead claim. He is a man alone. You are a woman alone. The town needs a teacher. You need a position. This arrangement, it solves a great many problems at once. This is not a teaching contract," she said, the words like stones in her mouth. This is a bill of sale. One of the other men snorted. Get you a husband and a roof, don't it? Better than what most of your people get, working on the railroad. The insult was a physical blow. Lin Fen stood up, her hands trembling. I was hired as a teacher. I am an educated woman. I am not property to be traded for a parcel of land. Stone's face hardened. You are a Chinese woman, alone, in the Nevada territory. Your options are not as plentiful as you might imagine. We sent the fare for your passage. We have made arrangements. Mr. Blackwood has agreed. You will find our offer is more than generous. He agreed to this, she asked, the question barely audible. She thought of the man outside, his bleak eyes and the rigid set of his shoulders. Mr. Blackwood understands his civic duty, Stone said smoothly. He has a daughter who needs schooling. He needs a wife. It is a logical and binding contract. Sign it, and the school is yours. Refuse, he paused, letting the weight of the threat settle in the small room, and the next wagon back to Reno leaves in a week. Gus will expect you to pay your own return fare. She knew what that meant. Her savings were gone, spent on the dress and the trunk and the small necessities for her new life. A week in a town like this with no money and no protector was a death sentence of a different kind. She looked out the small, grimy window. Samuel Blackwood was still there, his back to the schoolhouse, a solitary figure against the vast, indifferent landscape. He was part of the trap. He was the cage. Her hand shook as she reached for the pen. She had come west seeking independence, a place to build a life on her own terms, using her mind. Instead, the frontier had met her with its own brutal logic, a logic that had nothing to do with books and everything to do with survival. She did not yet know that the silent man outside was just as trapped as she was. She dipped the pen in the inkwell, the scratching sound loud in the sudden silence. The signature was a surrender. But as her name dried on the page, a different feeling took root beneath the fear, a cold, hard defiance. They had bought her, but they did not own her. The first week was a silent truce. Samuel installed her in the small spare room of his ranch house, a simple but clean space with a narrow bed and a window that looked out over a dusty corral. The house was a testament to a life paused. A woman's touch was absent everywhere, from the unadorned mantelpiece to the threadbare curtains. Samuel spoke to her only when necessary, his words clipped and practical. Supper's at 6. The well is there. A Clara will show you the path to the school. Clara was his daughter, a slip of a girl, 8 years old, with her father's stormy eyes and a silence that was even deeper. She followed Lin Fen to the schoolhouse that first Monday, a small, ghost-like presence at her side. She carried no slate, no books. She simply sat in the back row while Lin Fen prepared for her students, her small hands folded in her lap, watching with an unnerving stillness. The students, a dozen of them between the ages of 6 and 14, were a mix of ranchers' children and miners' offspring. They stared at her with open, unabashed curiosity. Her face, her hair, her straight-back posture. She was a spectacle. "Are you gonna teach us to use chopsticks?" a lanky boy with a spray of freckles called out. His name was Billy Parsons, son of a foreman at the silver mine. "I am going to teach you arithmetic and letters," Lin Fen replied, her voice even. "My name is Miss Lin. Let's begin with the alphabet." She wrote the letters on the large slate at the front of the room, her chalk strokes precise and confident. This was her ground. In here, she was not a purchased bride or a foreign curiosity. She was a teacher. But the whispers followed her all day, little barbs of ignorance and suspicion. Billy Parsons and his 2 friends, brutish boys who were far too old for the simple lessons, were the worst. They snickered when she turned her back, mimicked her speech in cruel, exaggerated tones, and kicked the dirt at the younger children during recess. Lin Fen said nothing, her face a mask of calm professionalism. Complaining would show weakness. She had to handle this herself. But her eyes kept drifting to Clara, who sat apart from the others under the lone cottonwood tree, tracing patterns in the dust, as immune to the taunts as she was to the friendships offered by the younger girls. The tension broke on Friday. During the midday break, Billy Parsons snatched a cornhusk doll from a small girl named Sarah. When Sarah began to cry, Billy held the doll aloft. "Look! The baby's crying for her dolly." "Give it back, Billy," Lin Fen said, her voice low and sharp as she approached the knot of children. Billy grinned, a mean, knowing look in his eye. He was testing her. "Or what, teacher? You gonna hit me with a ruler?" He tossed the doll not to Sarah, but over to one of his friends. Before Lin Fen could respond, a small figure shot forward. It was Clara. She ran straight at the larger boy holding the doll and tried to wrench it from his grasp. He shoved her, hard. Clara stumbled and fell, her head hitting the hard-packed earth with a sickening thud. Something inside Lin Fen snapped. She was across the schoolyard in an instant, kneeling beside the stunned and crying girl. A red welt was already rising on Clara's temple. Lin Fen looked up at the boys, and for the first time since arriving in Redemption Gulch, the fear in her was replaced by a pure, cold rage. "You will go to Mr. Blackwood's ranch now," she said to Billy, her voice shaking slightly. "You will tell him what you did." Billy's bravado faltered. "My pa says I don't have to listen to you. I am the teacher here," she said, rising to her full height. "And that little girl is his daughter. You will go." But Billy and his friends just laughed, a cruel, jeering sound. They knew she had no real power. She was alone, an outsider he could torment with impunity. It was then that a shadow fell over them. Samuel Blackwood stood at the edge of the schoolyard, a coil of rope in one hand. He must have been mending a fence nearby. He had seen the whole thing. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't run. He simply walked toward them, his long strides eating up the ground. The laughter died in the boys' throats. He stopped in front of Billy Parsons, his presence sucking all the air out of the yard. He was not a tall man, but he seemed to tower over the boy. He looked from Billy to the welt on Clara's head, and something in his expression turned to granite. "You pushed my daughter," Samuel said. "It wasn't a question." She run at us," Billy stammered. Samuel's gaze was unrelenting. "You will apologize to Miss Lin. Then you will apologize to Clara. Then you will spend the rest of your afternoon stacking firewood behind my house. If I hear so much as a whisper of you troubling anyone in this schoolyard again, I will have a talk with your father. And he will listen. Do you understand me?" Billy nodded, his face pale. He mumbled an apology to Lin Fen, then to Clara, who was now hiding behind Lin Fen's skirts. Samuel pointed toward his ranch without another word, and the three boys scurried off like chastened coyotes. Samuel then knelt, his large, rough hands hovering uncertainly over his daughter's head. "Are you all right, little bird?" he asked, his voice suddenly gentle, stripped of its hard edges. Clara just nodded, her face buried in Lin Fen's green dress. Samuel looked up at Lin Fen, and for the first time, she saw something other than weariness in his eyes. It was a flicker of gratitude, and something more complex. "Shame." "Thank you," he said quietly. "For looking after her." The schoolhouse, the contract, the town, for a moment, it all faded away. There was only the three of them in the dusty yard, a broken circle that had, for a brief second, held together. The ground had shifted. He had defended her. Not as part of a contract, but because it was the right thing to do. What he didn't know was that in defending her, he had given her the one thing she had and had since she arrived, a sliver of hope. That evening, a fragile quiet settled over the ranch house. Clara, exhausted from her ordeal, had fallen asleep soon after supper. Lin Fen sat at the kitchen table, mending a tear in one of Clara's dresses by the light of a kerosene lamp. The needle moved in and out of the fabric, a small, repetitive motion that soothed the frayed edges of her nerves. Samuel entered the room so silently she didn't notice him until he set a cup of steaming tea on the table beside her. He didn't look at her, busying himself with banking the embers in the wood stove. "I'm sorry for what happened today," he said to the stove. "Those boys, their fathers work the mines. They learn their manners from a mule. It was not your fault, Lin Fen replied, not looking up from her sewing. Clara was very brave. She hasn't been brave for a long time, he said, his voice low. He finally turned from the stove, leaning against the rough-hewn wall. Not since her mother passed. The name of his late wife hung in the air between them, an unspoken presence. Lin Fen stitched in silence, giving him space to continue or retreat. Fever, 2 winters ago, he said, as if answering a question she hadn't asked. It was fast. 1 week she was hanging laundry, the next, gone. Clara hasn't said more than 2 words at a time since he ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of profound exhaustion. The council, Stone especially, they came to me a few months back. Said the town needed a school, but the only good parcel was on my claim. Said a teacher wouldn't come without a proper place to live, a family to ground her. They said it was a practical solution. He finally met her eyes, and the shame she had seen earlier was there, stark and raw. It wasn't right. What they did. What I agreed to. It was a coward's way. I was just so tired of her being alone. Of being alone. The confession landed in the quiet room with the weight of a physical blow. It reframed everything. He wasn't a callous jailer, he was a fellow prisoner, locked in the same cage of circumstance and grief. I have not been a wife to you, Lin Fen said, her voice soft but clear. It was a statement of fact, not an apology. A sad, wry smile touched his lips for the first time. I haven't asked you to be. I never would. The contract. He shook his head. It's just paper. You're the teacher. That's all that matters. You're good for Clara. I see it. Before she could respond, he pushed himself off the wall. There's something you should see. He retrieved a small, carved wooden box from the mantelpiece and placed it on the table. He opened the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a small, exquisitely carved bird, its wings half spread as if in mid-flight. My wife, Mary, she carved it for Clara, he explained. She loved to watch the finches at the creek. He gently lifted the bird and held it out. After the funeral, Clara put it in this box and never looked at it again. He paused. This afternoon, after you brought her home, I found it on your pillow. She left it for you. Lin Fen looked from the bird in his calloused palm to his earnest, troubled face. This tiny wooden object was more than a gift. It was a bridge. A message from a silent child, an offering of trust she had given to no one else. Gently, she put down her sewing and took the bird from him. Her fingers brushed his, a brief, startling warmth. A current passed between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of shared loss and newfound understanding. Their fragile peace was shattered 2 days later by the arrival of Jebediah Stone. He rode up to the ranch house, his horse a fine, glossy chestnut that stood in stark contrast to Samuel's working stock. He dismounted with the air of a man who owned everything he surveyed. Blackwood, he called out, not waiting for an invitation. A word. Samuel met him on the porch, Lin Fen watching from the kitchen window. Stone didn't waste time with pleasantries. I hear you interfered in a matter at the school, Stone said, his voice oozing disapproval. Disciplining the parson's boy. That is the teacher's job. Unless she is not capable. He glanced meaningfully toward the house. She is more than capable, Samuel said, his voice flat and hard. The boy pushed my daughter. I handled it. You handled it by creating a problem with the mine foreman, Stone countered. Parsons is making noise in town. Says his boy won't be ordered around by you on behalf of her. The pronoun was laden with contempt. This arrangement was meant to be smooth, Blackwood. To integrate the school into the community, not to cause division. The division was caused by an ignorant boy and his ignorant father, Samuel shot back. Stone smiled, a cold, unpleasant thing. Be that as it may, perception is reality. The perception is that you are taking the side of an outsider against one of our own. It complicates things. He took a step closer. Perhaps the arrangement needs to be solidified. Made more official. A child would quiet the talk. An heir secures the homestead claim beyond any doubt. The contract is quite clear on the expectation of a full and binding marital union. The threat was vile, and it was clear. He was calling in the ugliest part of their paper bargain. Lin Fen felt a wave of nausea. She saw the muscles in Samuel's jaw tighten, his hands clench into fists at his sides. "You will not speak of my wife that way," Samuel said, his voice a low growl. The word "a wife" hung in the air, a shield he had thrown up to protect her. He had claimed her, not as property, but as a person under his protection. Stone's eyes widened in mock surprise. "Your wife? So it is a real marriage, then? I'm delighted to hear it. I'm sure the town will be, too." He tipped his hat with false politeness. "I'll expect to see you both in church on Sunday. As a family." He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and poison in his wake. Samuel stood on the porch for a long time, his back rigid. Lin Fen came to the doorway. "He cannot force us," she said quietly. "He can make our lives a misery," Samuel replied, turning to face her. The weariness was back in his eyes, but now it was laced with a protective fire. "He can turn the town against you, against the school. He can find a way to break the contract and send you away. He thinks he controls us." He looked at her, at the quiet strength in her posture, the defiance in her eyes. He saw the teacher who had faced down bullies for his daughter, the woman who had sat and mended her dress, the person who understood the gift of a small wooden bird. "His wrong," Samuel said, and it was a vow. They went to church that Sunday. It was a declaration. Samuel walked with his head held high, Clara's hand held firmly in his. Lin Fen walked beside them, her green dress clean and pressed, her expression unreadable. They sat in the Blackwood family pew, a silent, united front. The whispers were a low hum, the stares like tiny arrows. Jebediah Stone watched them from the front row, a smug look on his face. He thought he had won. He had forced them into a public performance of a lie. But as the circuit preacher droned on about damnation and grace, Clara, who had been sitting stiffly between them, reached out and slipped her small hand into Lin Fen's. It was a small, simple gesture, but in the suffocating silence of the church, it felt like a thunderclap. Samuel saw it, and a look passed between him and Lin Fen over the top of their daughter's head. It was a look of shared conspiracy, of alliance. Stone had meant to humiliate them, but he had only succeeded in binding them closer together. 6 months later, the last of the winter snow had melted from the high peaks, and the valley was turning green. The schoolhouse bell rang out, clear and steady in the spring air. Inside, Lin Fen stood before a class that had grown to 20 students. Billy Parsons and his friends were gone, their fathers having moved on to another claim. In their place were eager new faces. The classroom was no longer just a box. The walls were covered with children's drawings, a map of the United States that Samuel had ordered from a catalogue, and pressed wildflowers that Clara had collected. The ranch house was different, too. Bright curtains, sewn by Lin Fen from bolts of calico, hung in the windows. Books now sat on the mantelpiece next to the carved wooden bird. The silence was gone, replaced by the sounds of a home, Clara reading aloud to her father in the evenings, Lin Fen's quiet humming as she graded slates at the kitchen table, the sound of Samuel's boots on the porch, no longer hesitant. Their life had found a rhythm, built not on the harsh demands of a contract, but on 1,000 small acts of kindness and respect. He had taught her how to read the clouds for rain and how to tell a good horse from a lame one. She, in turn, had brought books and conversation and laughter back into his quiet house. She had healed his daughter with patience and learning, and in doing so, had healed something in him, too. Jebediah Stone's power had withered. When he'd tried to raise objections at a town meeting about the school's unconventional leadership, he found himself shouted down. The parents, seeing their children learning to read and write, seeing the clear and steady benefit of the school, had no patience for his insinuations. They had seen Samuel Blackwood stand by his wife. They had seen a good woman make a home and a future in their valley. They chose the evidence of their own eyes over the poison of one man's ambition. One warm evening in May, Samuel and Lin Fen sat on the porch, watching the last light fade from the sky. Clara was asleep inside, a book open on her chest. "The deed for the homestead came through," Samuel said quietly. "It's official. The land, the school, it's ours." Lin Fen looked at the schoolhouse, its silhouette dark against the purple dusk. The building that had once been the symbol of her entrapment now looked like a promise. "I have my salary from the last 6 months saved," she said, her voice even. "It is enough for passage back to San Francisco, if that is what I choose." Samuel went very still. He turned to look at her, his face serious in the dim light. "Is it?" he asked. She met his gaze. She thought of the life she'd left, the life she had imagined for herself. It was a life of lonely independence. It had a certain appeal. But it did not have this quiet porch, or the sound of a child's steady breathing from the next room, or the presence of this decent, quiet man beside her. "I also have a letter," she said, reaching into the pocket of her apron. She handed it to him. It was addressed to her sister in San Francisco. He unfolded it, holding it up to the last of the light. "I have found a good life here," he read aloud, his voice rough with emotion. "I have a school, and a home. I have a daughter. And I have a husband, a good man whose hand I would be proud to take. Not by contract, but by choice." He looked up from the letter, his stormy eyes full of a light she had never seen before. He reached out and took her hand. His palm was rough, but his touch was gentle. "Lin Fen," he said, her name a question and an answer all at once. "My choice, Samuel," she replied, her voice firm, "is to stay." The schoolhouse stood as a testament, not to a coercive contract, but to the stubborn, quiet way two people, caught in a trap, had decided to build a life instead. They had been sold a bargain, but what they forged together, out of respect and a shared, gentle love, was something far more valuable. It was real. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.